to be a meeting place for civil society, for people who are trying to make Australia more fair, just and sustainable, and to equip all of us to continue making a positive difference in solidarity with each other throughout this time. It's to share ideas, to cheer each other on, and to support each other. It's a project of Essential, of The Guardian, of the Centre for Australian Progress, Principal Co, and the Community Council for Australia. Today in the chat, we have David Crosby, the CEO of the Community Council for Australia, who'll be able to respond to your questions as you write them there. A little bit of housekeeping as we begin. Firstly, it would be excellent if you could change your name in your little video box so that it's not just your first name, but your last name, if you're comfortable with that, and also an organisation if you represent one. So if you run your cursor over your video box, there's 3 little dots in the right-hand corner, and that will allow you to edit your name, and it can look similar to mine, how it said Brad Chilcott /Essential. Secondly, it would be really cool if you could keep your videos on. It really adds to the sense of being together, even though we're all across the country. And if you want to see people much better, up in the top right of your screen, you can toggle between speaker view and gallery view. I much prefer gallery view because I can see all the beautiful people I'm with. And lastly, we are learning as we go in this brave new world of mega Zoom conferences. We've got 175 people in this meeting so far and climbing, about 400 registered. And so please forgive us for the clunkiness or the mistakes or all of that. And you can give feedback in the chat as to how you're feeling about it all. And of course, we're here today not to listen to me ramble about Zoom, but to meet our very special guest, Reverend Tim Costello. He is the chair of the Community Council for Australia, the executive director of MICA Australia, chief advocate of the Thriving Communities Partnership, the senior fellow for the Centre of Public Christianity, the patron of the National Youth Commission, and the spokesperson for the Alliance on Gambling Reform. For 15 years, and probably what we've seen him on our TV representing for a lot of this time, he was the chief executive and the chief advocate for World Vision Australia. And among his many other amazing list of accolades, he was named as one of Australia's 100 living treasures. You're a treasure, Tim Costello. Why don't you please silently applaud Tim wherever you are. Thank you for joining us. So Tim, how are you going? How has your life changed over the last few weeks?
Well, it's been a series of losses, from the very small ones, my daily coffee and reading the paper in my coffee shop, to much bigger ones. I can't visit my 91-year-old mother, who's very alert, so I can talk to her, but it's in lockdown, her home. I couldn't go to a wedding, and I feel for a bride, and lots of brides and grooms for that matter, who will never have the wedding pictures that they wanted to have. To much more serious things. I've been talking to my friends in India, in Rwanda, in Uganda, and there the notion of social distancing is just so difficult compared to us in Australia. My friends in India saying when you've got 4 hours notice, because they're going to lock down all the state borders to get home, and you're walking 400 kilometres, you can't social distance. To friends in Syria saying, wash our hands every hour. We can't wash our children once a week. How do you socially distance in a tent of 12 people? To then a whole lot more losses that we know of with friends who have COVID-19 and awaiting more loss. So at one level, it's being just alert to the fact that I am absolutely blessed. Most of us, not all of us in Australia, most of us are, but my 70-year-old friends just in my street, now locked in their house, they're not leaving, and then thinking of Indigenous, where the health issues are much greater. at 50 for an Indigenous person, you're much more likely to be at risk, not 70. So yeah, it's an experience of confinement and loss.
Yeah, which we're all experiencing in different ways. And it's over the last few days, you've been setting up the Charities Crisis Cabinet with David at the Community Council for Australia, and responding to the way that charities are both being impacted by this crisis, but also having to respond to the impact that it's having on others. Can you tell us a bit about the Charities Crisis Cabinet and what the problem is that it's solving and what you're hoping to do with it?
Well, we're all aware of the National Crisis Cabinet that Scott Morrison and the states really revamped COAG is, and we had the idea of there needs to be a community crisis cabinet. We called it charities, maybe community cabinet is an alternative word we could discuss, because actually the solutions have to come from grassroots level. At top level, absolutely, the stimulus packet, only government has a big enough balance sheet to actually economically get us through that. So this crisis cabinet has written already in the capacity, its forerunner, Community Council Australia, joined by other groups that have written to the Prime Minister, the Catholic Network and other charities, really saying that charities, like all sectors, are undergoing a crisis. We had 7 points. We wanted the Prime Minister and Treasurer to offer more security to maintain programs and employment. Because we employ 1.3 million people, we wanted greater flexibility. So releasing us from narrow contractual obligations that we as charities are under. We have requested additional funding to meet the demand. Some 200 million announced yesterday, particularly in the area of food and certainly mental health, which we commend. We wrote about offering wage subsidies, and we know right at the moment the government is thinking about this and promising a package. Tax incentives for people to give, really raising it from every dollar you give to a charity, getting a $2 tax deduction to actually encourage philanthropic and personal giving. Adapting service delivery. What we're really wanting there is a digital rebate scheme to do things like this, because charities at their best overcome isolation. They include people who are vulnerable. They provide community. Isolation is the enemy of mental health. It's the enemy of well-being. Charities have been the vehicle for doing that. So those have been the asks, and the Cabinet will continue both to put the asset on government, to congratulate them, to listen now, and this is what the forum's about, to what you're asking for us to represent. So just like Business Council of Australia has a go-to person, and we always see Jennifer Westacott there, we in the community charity sector want the solidarity of a voice and being at the table. That's the idea.
So what do you make of this announcement, the $200 million? Is it enough? I know it is in response to one of your requests, but what's it going to do? Is there more that needs to happen?
Look, almost certainly. The truth is that Oz Harvest and Second Bite and so many other groups were no longer getting the expired canned foods because Woolworths and Coles were actually selling them to hoarders, making a killing. The food donations have dropped over 30%. And the one thing about people is they have to eat every day. And this is continuous. So that 200 million for those frontline services is indeed very welcome. Is it enough? No. We're going to actually hear from you about the gaps, about what we need to be advocating, what should be included in next packages. We weren't even in the first package. You might remember it was only businesses with the first economic stimulus package. We're often invisible and forgotten, even though we're 8% of GDP. Well, that's behind us. We are in that package. Even the USA has charities in the package. And as the whole world has become socialist, it seems Bernie Sanders has won without the nomination of the Democrats. Governments expanding programs, even America with 2.2 trillion, and charities at least included. But this cabinet is to actually map this, listen, respond, to give a focal point for it.
You sent me this morning a statistic from the United States saying that 3/4 of not-for-profits would run out of cash within 6 months, and 19% said in the States that they only had cash to last for a month. We don't have those figures here for Australia, but I imagine it's somewhere similar. What does that mean for this crisis that we're in now?
Look, we know that the data is there in the ACNC about how financially viable or not in months most charities are. We certainly want to dig that out and actually repeat that sort of New York Times analysis of America, again, to highlight what this would mean. Most of the people on this call, if they're leaders of charities, not-for-profits, know that we made a virtue of having low admin costs and even very low reserves to say it's money in, it's money out, we exist for others, that's the charitable proposition. So very few of us have reserves to see us through 3 months, 6 months. And part of the grief that I feel is that we know at the end of 6 months, the landscape will look very different for charities, that some of the people on this call presently leading through crisis may not have charities. And I want to find a way to actually honour that, admit that, grieve that, but also tell the story of that. At the moment, we don't know the specific answer, except that it's probably very similar to America in terms of financial sustainability for most charities.
Tim, we have one quick question. Is there any plans, or have you already made that letter from the Charities Crisis Cabinet to the PM public? Is that available for people?
It's on the Community Council website. Is that right, David? Put a finger up. Yes.
If you could put the link up in the chat, David, so people could access that, that would be fantastic. So with all of that in mind, Tim, and with the purpose of Australia at Home being that we can act in solidarity and support of each other, what can we do, the people on this call, what can we do to respond, to help raise the issues that charities are facing, to get behind those that are struggling? What are the solutions?
Well, I think this is part of the solution. We feel if you're leading a charity very isolated, even in good times, I had sleepless nights laying off a staff person. Well, what is the anxiety and the sleeplessness when you're having to stand down so many people? We need to share when the government does announce its package of maybe subsidising wages up to 80% of salary. We've been told we're not going to follow the UK, we're going to do a very Australian model, but it looks and smells like it's going to be pretty similar to the UK. That may allow us to share, okay, my first job as a leader in a charity was to protect my staff, that anxiety. Maybe I now can see some protection. And then go to the second stage. Why do we exist? And we don't exist just to protect jobs of staff. We exist to serve the people that we are set up to serve. Many people, from the vulnerable to those in arts to a whole range of public goods. And to really focus on, in these times, if we're not just focusing on our survival and staff, how do we share together as a sector what is being done to serve those people?
Yeah.
Where are the gaps? What can we do with people who maybe our staff getting 80% of their salary to release them for other charitable groups that need them? What are the data banks, and they're starting, of almost people's army data banks of people who exist. And one of the interesting things to me when I think about the times we're in, every disaster I went to in the last 16 years, it was a disaster where you were, but beyond the local place, economies were functioning, you could raise donations, you could leave a support, you could mobilise. This disaster, this virus is everywhere. There's no border that's stable and normal beyond just the present disaster.
Mm.
And it sort of reshapes the purpose. It's as if we charities said, you busy people in jobs can trust us to be there to create community, to serve the vulnerable, or do whatever the arts are, animal welfare, and us doing it for you, you give us some money. That's the value proposition. You have the confidence sleeping at night that someone is showing that charitable presence that you can't do because you have a job. What we're now seeing with charities not being able to convene and do face-to-face work and run neighbourhood centres, run a whole host of things. One, having to innovate and try and do digital work. But secondly, we're seeing people who themselves are at home and have time on their hands, picking up the charitable instinct, caring for neighbours, buying groceries for someone shut in, dropping a note. So suddenly the boundaries are fluid. It's no longer we just do the charitable work and you give us dollars. It's actually, this is calling forth a charitable response from all of us. Now that is something we need to applaud, whilst at the same time say we actually have some deep experience in what can work and how it works best and where the gaps are and how we might mobilise best. So I think thinking deeply about our purpose, that we actually exist for those we serve, and telling that story, sharing that in these forums is incredibly important.
So it would be great in our chat, which we can capture the whole text that appears in the chat as part of these conversations. It would be great if people could write down what they think the gaps are, the things that haven't been noticed, and that Community Council for Australia can capture those and be part of telling that story publicly. There's also a Save Our Sector website that that our community are hosting and that Community Council for Australia are supporting. David will put that up in the link to that in the chat as well. But really, it's so important that we continue to tell the stories about the gaps that are appearing already in the chat, in the messages that I'm getting on my phone next to me. Thinking about how we do food security in regional and rural areas is an important thing for us to think about, not just in cities. Also, so you know, this whole discussion is being recorded. People will be able to watch it again on the Australia at Home website. And thanks for all your questions that are coming through. We are going to have time to throw to some of you to ask those questions towards the end. Tim, we've been running some online focus groups as part of our work at Essential, capturing a sense of what the public are feeling, what people are experiencing as this crisis unfolds. And I wanted to read to you what one person who are in a high-risk category, what they had to say about it. It's almost poetic the way it came out in this focus group. If my partner catches it, I will catch it. If I make a mistake, I will catch it. Even if I don't make a mistake, I may still catch it. If I don't catch it, someone I know likely will. It will be a really sad time for almost everybody. And your piece in The Guardian this morning really touched on this. How do you think Australians are preparing emotionally for what is unfolding? Do you think we have the tools available to us to prepare emotionally for the grief that we're about to endure?
Well, I don't think any of us can answer that question because we've never, ever been in this situation before. And that piece in The Guardian was really quoting Camus about exile being a void within and walking through life with shadows and needing to root those shadows in the real earth of the distress that we're all feeling in terms of then how we show solidarity for one another. Really what I'm trying to say is that solidarity, I think, is the new selfishness. In an interdependent world where my health depends on my neighbours actually self-isolating and playing by the rules, to show solidarity and care is actually selfishness. That neighbourliness is now the way of loving yourself. To be a good neighbour is also the best way to love yourself. Look, in terms of the next wave that is coming, and I've been talking to friends in Italy who are in Milan, who are just so struck with the grief, but trying to find ways and rituals to actually lift people's spirits. We're going to have to find rituals, whether at 7 o'clock every home has a candle and an open window and something that just says we're still in this together. We know that we don't choose the times that we're in, but we have some freedom to choose how we respond in these times. And for me, if there isn't grief over real loss, which we're facing and will only get greater, disenfranchised grief leads to despair, to resentment, to scapegoating. If we actually can own grief and root it in that earth of distress, real distress, I think that gives a path to resilience, to hope, to solidarity. I think at best, this is what community and charities, what they do. It's the intangibles, not just the service delivery. So I think part of our agenda is actually sharing ways that we are dealing with grief and bringing communities together.
Yeah, I really loved the idea of a shared sense of exile. And in Camus' book, The Plague, it was like this strange idea that we're in exile in our most familiar places with our most intimate relations. And yet we still feel like we're in exile. We're distant from our jobs, our familiar things, the dreams that we had about what we might achieve in this time, weddings, like you mentioned earlier. And so part of what this is all about is a time every day at 1 o'clock when we can all be together and hear from someone like yourself, Tim, or from others. We have Catherine Murphy on tomorrow. But like you say, there's a need for us to continue to develop new forms of sharing this exile together that acknowledges the grief and the suffering that people are enduring, not just through the loss of loved ones or the distance from loved ones, but the real suffering that charities are starting to address as people lose income and lose food security, etc. So, Tim, we're going to start moving towards some questions in a moment, but is there anything else that you particularly want to share with us before we get into some of these questions?
Yeah, I think one of the most important tasks for us is to actually see how this is playing out in terms of equity. The truth is the virus is indiscriminate. Boris Johnson's got it, Tom Hanks, Peter Dutton. No one's superior, no one's inferior. Humans always have a need to tell a story about why I'm superior to someone. It might be my postcode or my gender or my caste and class. No one's actually invulnerable. I think this equity question then says, but there will be profoundly different ways in how those who get COVID-19 get access to services. That's where I'm thinking of Indigenous Australia, why that's a profoundly moral issue, given our failure, manifest failure up to now to deal with issues of recognition, of reconciliation. That's why I'm ringing friends in least developed countries, poor health systems, the virus just starting to roar into life. The inequity of how we actually respond to this is going to show the fault lines, including in our communities, for those who have been homeless, who have been suffering with insecure housing. So that, I think, is a particularly important task of a charities cabinet.
Well, thanks. With that in mind, we might actually throw to Brooke Prentice from Common Grace, who has a question on this and on what our First Nations people can teach us in a time of lament. Brooke, can you come online. The way this will work is someone in the background, Jess or Ariane, are going to unmute people one by one, and then they'll be able to ask their question. If you're there, Brooke, it's over to you.
Yeah, thanks. I was hoping that my question would just be answered. I think it's pretty clear that, you know, as an Aboriginal person, I'm very concerned about the lack of Aboriginal voice, Aboriginal reporting through COVID-19, except that this is going to have a serious impact on Indigenous communities. We haven't seen a lot of translating of the things into Indigenous languages for those communities in the Northern Territory. There's been huge issues, people being told to go back to homeland, but they don't have the access because of the inequality that already exists in Australia for access to petrol, bus tickets, all of these things. And the reality that most Aboriginal peoples live in the capital cities, you know, so there's so much. And so I guess the key to my question is, when will this nation, Australia, and including the charities and community sector, finally let Aboriginal people lead in this space? And we have a moral obligation to do that in the communities and charities sector. And this could be the way we actually lead the nation. And if we are to ever have a voice to Parliament as Aboriginal peoples, we've seen the rejection of the statement from the heart. But at this COVID-19 time, all of these crisis committees are developing. But again, where is the I know that there's an Aboriginal health one, but where are Aboriginal voices in the midst of this? And how will those empower, including those empowered in the charities and community sector, actually give up power to let us have a voice and to lead?
Thanks, Brooke. Tim, you want to respond to that?
Yeah, look, I totally agree with that. And I feel that the inequity I was talking about is particularly exacerbated because of the failure of where we are today. So absolutely take that on board.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Brooke, for asking the question. We're going to try and get Rebecca Thorpe on now, if we can, to ask a question around advocacy. Rebecca, are you available there?
Yeah, hi Tim.
Fantastic. So Rebecca, if you could ask Tim your question, that'd be fantastic.
No worries. Tim, I was just wondering if you could speak to what all this means for advocacy. You've spoken a lot about the delivery of services for charities, but how will this impact advocacy, do you think?
So I think in a crisis that's global, where literally every country in the world is asking the question, how big is our government's bank balance? We need a different tone in our advocacy. Our advocacy is often pointing out the inequities, and we should still be doing that. But we know that if the tone is screechy, if it's accusatory, if it's finger pointing or virtue signalling, it breaks down trust. Last night I was talking to a friend in Washington, DC, who is in great pain over President Trump's leadership there. But he was saying the toxic hatred in the US, a nation coming apart, where Republicans don't just disagree with Democrats, they hate them. Where Democrats don't just disagree with Republicans, they hate them. The COVID-19 they're viewing as an opportunity to actually try and find some common vulnerability, some lowering of the screaming. Now, I think our advocacy isn't necessarily screaming, and we need to not ever compromise on who we're advocating for, but tone is absolutely everything in this time.
Great. I mean, I've got a question from my own, one of the areas that I'm interested in, which is how people who are refugees, people seeking asylum, people on temporary visas are, you know, being impacted by this moment. But it also relates to advocacy in the sense that I find it really hard to get people interested at a time when more than ever, it's, you know, Australians first, look after those who are supposed to be here, etc. Have you got any thoughts on how we, actually, and I saw a few people saying we need to start raising the foreign aid budget again, and having similar reactions, you know, why would we spend money overseas when our own are suffering? How can we keep putting these kind of issues on the agenda when the need for citizens and at home is so great?
Yeah, I think our sector, above all other sectors, starts with this assumption that human dignity is universal, it's indivisible. No one can be left behind. So people on TV, TPVs, people who are overseas students who are found here cannot be left behind. Otherwise, we fundamentally fracture a universal consensus about human dignity. The ironies are not lost on any of us that whilst we had the most amazingly draconian border security controls against boat people, people could walk off boats, cruise ships, and spread the virus, and just buck passing between state and Homeland Security over that. It's quite unbelievable. Look, here's the hopeful thing, that when we couldn't get any increase in New Start, even when John Howard, the Business Council of Australia, Governor of the Reserve Bank, were all screaming for it, suddenly COVID has at least seen, for the next 6 months, the increase in New Start that's come about. Now, why can't that be equally for TPVs? Why can't that be for groups who otherwise are going to be left behind? I think our advocacy needs to be, with the right tone, just pointing out this is not a time for anyone to be left behind.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'm going to send, Andrew Palmer, I'm going to invite you to add your voice and to ask a question of Tim. Are you there?
Yep, I'm here. Hi, Tim.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. So my question relates to that element of our broader network who have limited English for various reasons and oftentimes come from collectivist cultures. It occurs to me that in a Western culture where we're not particularly touchy-feely, the whole idea of removing ourselves from touch and even physical interaction kind of fits us culturally. That's not true for the majority of non-Western cultures. And some of those cultures within the Australian context also have limited access to the internet, limited access to services, and limited access to power, and limited access to language capacity. Is there a plan to engage them, or if there isn't, could we brainstorm a way to engage some of those cultural leaders?
Yeah, we learned, Andrew, in the Ebola crisis, African cultures, which absolutely required touch and hugging and grief and being there at the bedside and at the burial, had to overnight profoundly change. And it was actually pastors and imams and religious leaders who really are the trusted ones in those cultures, much more trusted than any politician or any secular leader, who had to go, Christian pastors had to go to mosques with imams in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and say, I agree with the imam, you cannot touch, you cannot go near your loved one. And it was extraordinarily difficult because of the cultures you're describing to get that message across, but it was life-saving. It did actually end the Ebola crisis. So it's not impossible. Difficult but not impossible. Look, on the language communication, it's a mystery to me when we are the most multicultural nation in the world. 29% of us born overseas, 48% of us with one parent born overseas, that we still have blocks in getting these messages into the languages, because we've known this for a long time. So that certainly should be on our radar.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Andrew. Peter Forday from Multicultural Australia in Queensland. Are you there at the moment? You can ask your question. You're unmuted now. Cool. So wait 1 second, Peter. Can one of our admins unmute Peter? I can do it. No. Gang. All right. Well, I'll ask Peter's question. Peter, you might have yourself on mute, maybe, but Peter's question was, how do we ensure that stimulus funding, including income guarantees, do not simply taxpayer fund or add taxpayer funds to the profits of large corporations and property owners?
Thanks, Brad. Can you hear me?
Oh, there he is. Hey, Peter.
Yeah, that was my fault. I apologise for that.
That's okay.
I guess, thank you for asking that, and thank you, Tim. I guess I want to acknowledge that this came from a conversation with Fahim Kandaka just yesterday about this very issue. So I guess our conversation we've been having are around any kind of concept of a guaranteed income may just continue to add profits to those who are already, not necessarily intentionally, but unintentionally profiting from this terrible situation. And is that a good outcome, or is that the only outcome that will be achieved through such funding?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And as we know, as recently as last Friday, the government weren't even going to be looking at this. They had gone for the safety net rather than the guaranteed subsidies of wages for firms to keep them on. So this is in motion as we speak, with a whole degree of difficulty about who's going to benefit and where are the funds actually going, certainly in that first stimulus package. In the US, we know that the 5-day delay in the package getting through Congress was because there were going to be no accountability for the big firms and the wealthy who were just going to be handed money. In the end, they still got $500 billion of the 2.1 trillion with very little accountability. It was better than what it was at the start, but still not great. They're exactly going to be the questions that we need to shine a light on here. And here's the truth that we're all dealing with in terms of inequity. It's the middle-aged and older, the middle class and wealthier that still have the power in this country. Think the last elections and capital gains tax, negative gearing, franked dividends, and yet the debt burden for the huge bailouts is on the younger generation already, who have been pretty much shafted by my baby boomer generation. But the demographics mean my baby boomer generation still has the political power. So whether it's bailout of firms and the transparency around profits sharing, or future responses where the burden now has to be shared equally, in my view, we have to have a wealth tax. We absolutely, post-COVID, have to move to far greater equity measures. Australia is one of the few nations without a wealth tax. We should be asking questions of those who have kept their jobs about sacrifice on their part. There needs to be a sense that we are sharing this pain together. Otherwise, legitimacy is lost. A mandate is lost. So your question goes right to the heart of something that needs to be higher on our priorities in laser-like focus.
Thank you.
Okay, a couple more questions. Thanks, Tim and Peter. There's been a few things turn up in the chat about climate change, and the risk is that we forget that is an ongoing catastrophe that is continuing to affect us all. It is a hard thing to advocate for in this moment. But Tim, how do you think our relationship and our advocacy for a response to climate change needs to be part of the current conversation?
So I don't know. I think we're at a fork in the road, and it could go either way. One good way would be to say, we now trust scientists and we trust medical and climate change experts. How foolish we were to not listen. Two, actually, there's a whole lot of things we were doing that were polluting, and they have closed down, and we're seeing some benefits, and we got on and lived okay, even in exile as we are, without some of those things. We don't need to go back to just business as normal. That's one fork in the road. The other fork in the road, which worries me, is that government indebtedness post-COVID will be so great, they will say, don't even ask for another cent in terms of green climate funds, in terms of we simply can't afford to do anything more. We've just got to get back to business, and that's what people want. I don't know which fork in the road it'll be, Brad.
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very concerning time, and it's really hard to know which way the government goes as we continue to spend money just to survive through this time, and whether their sudden discovery of acting in everyone's best interests continues, or whether we go back to profit for their biggest donors at the end of this. I'm going to throw to Donna now. If you're there, Donna, you've got a question about what we can learn from Royal Commissions. If you're been unmuted, I'd love you to ask Tim your question. Donna? Oh, yep, you're unmuted now, Donna. If you could speak, that would be great. Okay, Donna's question says this. How can we share learnings gained from the Royal Commission into Abuse, charities and churches with families at this time? The estimated higher rates of domestic and family violence and links to child abuse are something that we need to plan and prepare for with preventative measures. Our platforms of charities and church networks are conduits of information to help prevent and intervene. Can this charity crisis cabinet include this in planning if needed?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and it goes to a very profound issue, which is the issue of a breakdown in trust. And whilst churches at grassroots level still meet weekly, have a, well, online now, but before COVID, weekly, pass around a plate, say how can we help and reach out in our community, and that's absolutely charitable work that we need. At institutional, denominational level, those denominations that ran institutions totally and traumatically for children victims failed, and they covered up and they moved on offenders and they protected reputation, not children. It happened in secular institutions too. It was a profound breakdown in trust, and right at the moment, the trust deficit. Do we trust the messages from our chief medical officers coming out of our national cabinet? Do we trust that business isn't going to just take this moment to actually feather its own nest, whether it's fossil fuel industry or the gambling industry, those self-interested vested interests that actually, because of political party donations to both sides of politics, really run politics. Are we actually going to see transparency that gives a sense of rebuilding trust? There can be no trust without transparency. COVID-19 is this moment to really demand transparency out of the vulnerability. We are all vulnerable, and vulnerability speaks of vulnerability, including institutional vulnerability, that never again will they be trusted unless they've learned the lessons.
Yeah, we know that some churches have responded with training and information around family and domestic violence, while others are still caught in traditional patriarchal structures and, making apologies for perpetrators rather than supporting victims first. And in this time in particular, it's those institutions and churches that really need to recognise the impact of this on the women and families in their congregations and organisations. We're going to go to Jenny McCaffer now. If you're there, Jenny, you're unmuted now to ask your question.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I'll see if I can put my video on. Okay. Hi, so I'm the CEO of Adult Learning Australia, and just responding because people were talking about language issues before, but 43% of adults have difficulty in relation to literacy and numeracy skills, particularly in relation to life skills and work. So I guess that's a major issue that needs to be considered, particularly for the disadvantaged groups, and something that we've been advocating about for a long time. So just need that to be considered, particularly as some of our members are trying to get students that are disadvantaged online to keep their courses going. Some of them are printing workbooks to give to them and communicate by text or email and so on. But the fact that many of them were undergoing foundation skills, which are the basic skills of communication, means it's going to be even more challenging for them. And the other thing is just looking at the transition period out of this, where adult and community education, so that's a range of, say, neighbourhood houses, community colleges, Aboriginal learning cooperatives all over Australia, where they might have the potential to help transition because they have community educators already in place. So looking at how we might play some sort of role in that transition, moving into the next phase as well. So
Thanks.
I guess that they're some of the key issues, and I think you've already talked about the digital literacy issues, as well as one of our members in Northern Territory was talking, they just didn't have internet service. So it was very difficult for them to get online. So that sort of drop off point.
You're just breaking up there a little. I might get Tim to respond.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. And innovation may require that we communicate in pictures, not words. We need to find ways of now doing things differently. The digital divide, absolutely true. You know, when I think about the number of us at home without necessarily full-time jobs, using the phone to coach, to read with people, to actually mentor those who have literacy, numeracy problems, the people's army idea. With all the issues coming up, what we're talking about is just a whole of social vulnerability response. And it feels very overwhelming, but this is really our moment to say, what can we do? How can we be innovative? Let's choose in these circumstances that we didn't choose to respond differently, to think innovatively, to mentor, to give our time.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tim. We're going to go to Jackie Softly now, who's been asking, along with some others, about representation for people living with disability. Jackie.
Hi, everyone. I have a son who has Down syndrome, and other family members who have disability. I know there are representatives from disability organisations here, and maybe they might be able to put this better than I can. However, the concerns for many of us, people with disabilities and carers, is that our population seems to be largely being ignored by government. We keep hearing about supports for older Australians, and that's fine, I'm an older Australian, and people with chronic illness and so forth as being vulnerable, but there is never a mention, it seems, of people with disabilities. And yet our community is being incredibly impacted by this virus. People are finding themselves without essential support for all kinds of reasons. People often can't get out, whether it's because of their they've got all people with disabilities and carers have not been recognised in the financial changes being made by government. So when everyone else was being recognised that they were losing their jobs, people with disabilities and people on carer pension, who also very often have part-time jobs in order to just get by, were missed out there. So there are the two $750 payments, but not that ongoing support to live throughout this period. So and there's there is also, and I'll finish off. There's also this this terrible worry that we know that people with disabilities. We heard at the Royal Commission, we know that people with disabilities are not seen as valued and prioritised, including in the health system. And this virus situation we're seeing overseas, that this becomes even more of an issue for our people. The question really, I think, for Tim is, what representation is there in the charity cabinet for people with disabilities? And I don't just mean disability service providers, most of whom who probably have charitable status and will be concerned about their viability going forward. But we really, really need to make sure that the voices of disabled people and their families are heard in this, because it really doesn't feel like it is. It's quite terrifying. Thank you.
And I think, thank you, Jackie, and those who are almost always the most vulnerable of the vulnerable, those with disabilities. And that's a very timely comment, and absolutely the Charities Cabinet will be looking seriously at representation and at advocacy. Can I say that generally, I think we have to accept that most of our bureaucrats are working really hard, trying to sort out packages on the run, trying to do their best, really complex, overlapping needs and vulnerability with packages, so that representations aren't just, are pushing on an open door with bureaucrats. They know that these people are very vulnerable, that you've represented. Knowing exactly how to advocate and how to get up into a package, something that really works for them when time's against you, when announcements are being made, every night it seems, with changing, often confusing messages, is quite an ask, and it's one that the Charities Cabinet, which basically is an honorary cabinet, is certainly trying to take up, but go with the wind that we know is there in the public service to try and respond.
Thanks, Jackie. Thanks, Tim. I would also like to note that we have Lenore Taylor online from The Guardian and from Guardian Australia, who have provided great support for Australians at home, and who have also just provided incredible coverage to all of Australians throughout this COVID crisis. So thank you, Lenore, for your support and for the ongoing incredible work of Guardian. And we have one last question that I'm going to go to. It was Jenny Gardner, is that right? I believe so.
It's Jack.
Jessica, sorry. I
That's
lost
okay.
in
Hi, Brad.
a
Hi,
myriad
Tim.
of text messages. Over to you, Jess.
No worries. Hi, I'm Brad. Hi, Tim, and everyone else online. I guess my concern is around, to me, there seems to be a gap between some of the measures that the government are announcing. So, for example, mental health is sort of my area. I'm a clinical social worker, so all of my counselling has transferred to online at this stage. I work with people who have trauma, relationship issues, severe mental health issues, children, adolescents, older people, so a real range, veterans. And essentially at this point, the government has made a move that we need to bulk bill, which essentially means that mental health services are being provided hugely under under cost. So that's about half of what it costs me with a very small client load, because I myself have a disability. I can only work a certain number of hours because of my own capacity. But even people that are working full-time really are not going to be able to maintain provision of really good, high-quality services online. So I guess my concern and my question is something around, I'm concerned that in a very short amount of time, people's goodwill and their own management of their family finances is going to run very thin. And people are going to, people like myself who are trying to operate in conjunction with organisations, but who are trying to manage, you know, in private practice, are actually going to withdraw services, and that suddenly there'll be a massive increase for demand on charities. And you know, when everything's already so overstretched, and I'm, you know, community minded and involved in a whole range of things, that's going to be a further wave of stuff, which I'm wondering if that's going to be unanticipated, and how do we I don't know, work together on that one? Because yeah, for me, my concern is essentially not about financially how I'll manage with my family, but it's although that is a concern, but I guess it's more about, as systems, the responses so far I think are something that's good, but they're also very limited. So yeah, just putting it out there if there's any response to that, because I think again we're so interconnected, and I'm not sure where you know, my clients, if I were not able to provide that service anymore, would actually land.
Thanks, Jess.
Yeah, thanks, Jessica. And I absolutely hear you, and others do here also. They're very blunt instruments, government policy, and we know that there's a whole lot of people who get hurt, and there's unintended consequences. Look, I really want to finish, because what I hear is your sense of anxiety and loss and the unanticipated consequences even for your clients. We are all dealing with fear and anxiety, and when we end up fearing fear itself, it's often called panic. And in these times, there's going to be very loose ends and blunt instruments, and how and why did they do that, and couldn't they see? I think it's really important for us to, raise our voice, but also to say, let's try and not panic. The fear of fear itself. The fear and anxiety is natural. The fear of the fear and panic actually is really disastrous in terms of throwing us into despair. So part of, I think, our sector's call is to really raise the light, recognise we're not going to be pulling off everything that we wish we could pull off, but actually keeping hope alive. Keeping that hope alive is really important.
Thank you, Tim. That's a really great way to round out our conversation, actually, that as we continue to gather together every day at one and continue to connect outside of this forum, develop new rituals and new ways to grieve, and also to be in solidarity, that is all about keeping hope alive. Thanks to everyone that contributed to the chat as well. We're going to collate all of that so that David and Tim and others can respond to the issues that you raised and get to work filling those gaps. But I'd also really like to encourage you, any of you who are from organisations who might want to get on board with Australia at Home, to support us to keep doing this, to get in touch with me. I'll put my email address up in the chat now as well. But we'd love organisations to be a part of continuing to make this happen. And I'd really like to thank the Community Council for Australia for being a big part of that, along with Guardian, the Centre for Australian Progress, Principal Co. It's been awesome to have your support so far, and thank you very much for joining in, everyone. Be back tomorrow at 1 o'clock for Catherine Murphy and Pete Lewis, who will be dissecting the latest results of the Essential Report and the other research we've been doing on how Australians are tracking through this time. Really appreciate you all. Thank you again. And thank you so much, Tim, for giving up so much time for us today.
Thank you.
1:31, perfect.
Yeah.